We are back with the Atma Paradigm, and today we are studying the morphological template of an organism, and this is session 7 in our series on life. So let's see where we had reached previously last week. Well, we considered several key issues related to what is termed the modern synthesis, and we explored some of the facets of the inner workings of a cell. What's DNA, what's a gene, and how the information of DNA is used by the cell for the cell's purposes. Now, I really have to acknowledge that the chemical processes involved in every cell of our body are extremely complex, and they involve many different pathways and all sorts of interrelated feedback loops. Biologists can spend an entire lifetime just exploring one line of reactions and perhaps never reach the end. So in these talks, we can cover only the main principles at work. However, I think even so, the challenges that we gave last week for biology that require explanation, they're still valid. And they are issues that have been debated within the mainstream circles. For instance, it just happened by synchronous timing, along with just after the talk last week, the New Scientist magazine here in the UK was published. And this week's topic was a special edition on the latest ideas influencing what it called the changing face of evolution, our greatest theory of nature. Now, in their lead article, they present almost all of the concepts that we discussed last week, albeit they remain faithful to the narrative of evolution. So, New Scientists presented evolution, but not exactly as you would have been taught it at school. They were recognizing the nuances and indeed weaknesses of some of the standard statements. So I would suggest that they validated many of the key factual points that we presented last week and exposed the same questions that we raised that lurk behind some of the kind of assumptions regarding biology and the evolutionary theory. So I take it as some kind of validation of the conclusions that we reached regarding the modern synthesis. The first point, that DNA, does it hold all the information? No, it doesn't. It's estimated that there is as much information within the rest of the cell as there is in all the DNA material put together within the nucleus. So the DNA molecule is more like a library from which the cell chooses which bits it wants to use and how it wants to use them. And DNA cannot be said to drive the actions or the functions of the cell. Now, that was clear from the examples we gave on differentiation during embryogenesis, the development of the embryo, and how after fertilization at the 8-cell stage of the zygote, the daughter cells start to become specialized. Now, what coordinates those processes within the cell? It's not DNA coding itself. Each functioning cell seems to have its own idea of what it is supposed to do. Now, there's bits of DNA coding found in the various organelles within the cell, but no one can say that they could be considered to be the coordinating agent of the overall processes of the cell. Conclusion, genes do not control biology. Nor, as we found out, there's no factor within the DNA or within our cells that can account for how the cells coordinate themselves into producing organs, systems, and ultimately the full morphological form of the body. DNA does not contain a blueprint or a template or anything that specifies the overall form of the body. So our conclusion was, whatever is producing the body, whatever is contributing to that coordination, this is not a bottom-up process. Now, although New Scientist and its article substantiated the many points we just made, it didn't venture into this territory of how biology is coordinated. It left that subject wide open. However, as we mentioned last week, other evolutionary biologists have looked at all this evidence, and on the basis of that, they are pressing the scientific world that it's time to update biology and realize that we are dealing with an essentially top-down process. And we went through how that is happening. That when we look at the activities of each cell of our body, we see that the genetic information available in the DNA molecule is being gathered and used selectively by the cell. It's corrected, it's edited, it's organized into the format that the cell requires for its purposes. And why is it doing that? Well, it's trying to produce particular proteins and RNA that the cell needs in order to fulfill the various functions of the cell's networks. So that's the next level up. And why is it doing that? Well, so that those pathways and chemical networks can fulfill the purposes of each of the bits of the subcellular organelles, those little bits of machinery that float around within the cell and do all the work of metabolism and looking after all its functioning. So in this way, the purpose of the cell is the driver for what takes place within it. Why is that? Well, because the cell itself seems to be playing a particular role. It's trying to be of a particular type in order to be to fit in, to create a certain type of tissue material that the body needs. For instance, could be skin cells or blood cells or brain cells or whatever, any of the 200 types. But again, why is it doing that? Well, so that the different types of tissue are available so that they can be organized into the specific forms. And these are complex structures of each of the key organs that the body contains. So why is the organ doing that? Because the organs are needed to play their role in one of the body systems that make up the entire organism. So from the higher levels, there is what these biologists say are purpose-driven requirements that determine how a system at a lower level will behave. Specifically, that the lower levels, we're talking from organs, tissue, cells, and all the way down, act in such a defined way that can really only be understood as intended to fulfill the needs of the higher levels, ultimately fulfilling the purpose of the overall organism. So, according to the systems biologists, living organisms function with a top-down process. And we looked at the question, well, what is the highest level of this? Where is this template for the body? So we discussed the idea that systems biologists, although they propose that higher than the individual organism is something they call the holobiont, which is the total effect of all environmental and ecosystem and social influences on that organism. Now, we acknowledged the effect that being part of an ecosystem or a social system might have on an individual organism. But there is no specifying power within this holobiont. It may have an influence, but it doesn't have specifying power. Rather, what is happening for an individual within an ecosystem is that the environment places stress in the form of a threat, or it offers opportunity for enhanced experience, or threat or opportunity. And the conscious nature of the organism then decides how it wishes to respond to those threats and opportunities. So our proposition is that it is the psychological intention generated within the mind of the organism that is the active principle that affects an organism's biology. The environment influences intention, but environment is not a direct player coordinating the biology of the individual organism. So we propose that psychological intention is therefore the purpose-driven imperative that systems biology needs in order to complete its top-down thesis. And we say that this concept may account for the ability of the organism as a whole to coordinate the functions of the chemistry of the body. Now, we set ourselves during these weeks the kind of quest to find the template that defines the form of the body. And we're going to develop that a bit more today. But to get there, there's a bit more we have to explore in terms of how psychology drives biology. And I'm going to start with a look at a branch of analysis, scientific analysis, called complexity theory, and how it might help us address a question. Biological systems are complex, but are they coordinated? Now, a typical example of a complex system in action is an ant colony. In the colony, each ant is a unit, a simple unit. They work together and they form highly complex networks. You know, the structures and the organization within a colony seems to manifest an overall intention and function, but there doesn't seem to be any overall coordination. Now, this is an example that is used by some people to suggest that complexity and emergent properties of complexity could arise from simple components just interacting together. Now, complexity theory is a field of science that tries to explore what makes a system complex, rather than just being, and I mean complex, rather than just being big or extensive. And I'm going to take you through the key principles of this theory. Here they are. The first one is that a complex system is composed of simple agents, like the ants. These are individual components of the system. And they're considered simple. You know, I don't want to be derogatory of an ant, but we consider them simple in relationship to the complexity of the overall system to which they belong. And we'd categorize humans as also being simple components of, like, a human city, the complexity of a city. So now, the key thing is for these simple components to come together to produce an actually complex system, then they have to interact with each other in what is called non-linear ways. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, it's hard to get an exact kind of understanding of this, but it kind of works like this. Here is a set of dominoes or tiles, and you push one at the end and they start to fall and one falls on the other. So it's a kind of simple deterministic event. They are interacting linearly, not just because they're in a line, but because it's a kind of straightforward process, one to the next in terms of causality. Now, if we had a situation where one of those tiles decides to act in an unpredictable way and not fall over, and maybe even hold up the one before it, then the interactions of this system would not be considered linear. Something has happened. One of those tiles is behaving in a kind of strange, weird way, and it's producing a non-linear effect. So this is not what we would expect. So in many ways, we're looking at predictability and things not being deterministically kind of straightforward. Now, conscious entities are good at producing non-deterministic effects. We are not snooker balls on the table bouncing around, or pool balls, if you like, being bounced around. You hit one and it goes off and hits another, which might mean it hit another one. Now that's a whole deterministic sequence of balls bouncing. It's kind of Newtonian. However, conscious entities don't act in such precise, predictable and conditioned fashions. Their individuality, rising from their free will and intention, produce unexpected non-linearity into the picture. And as a result of the components interacting in non-linear ways, the theory says that we should expect to see some form of emergent structure or behavior appearing at the overall system level. Now, emergent behavior means that the results of the interactions of all the bits of the system produces an effect which seems greater or different than you think you should be able to get from the sum of its parts. So it's a kind of synergetic effect. So it has features that couldn't be accurately predicted by considering the activities by themselves. For instance, if you think what an individual ant might be capable of, and you just thought, well, there's a lot of ants, you would hardly extrapolate to the complexity of the organization of these ant colony empires that are often built. So this, in complexity terms, is called emergent properties. Now, the reason for calling it emergent is that it is assumed that the complexity has emerged without having been organized or coordinated by any centralized or overall entity or power. So this is the fourth and perhaps the most vital conclusion of complexity theory, that there is a complex system does not seem to have any overall or central coordination. However, this fourth conclusion really only works because it rests specifically on item number 2, i.e. the ability of individuals who make up the whole thing to being able to interact in non-linear ways. So this is where I'm going to do a little bit of analysis. Stick with this and it'll become easier as I explain it. So in effect, what this boils down to is one of two scenarios. Either it's a situation in which the individuals of a system interact in linear ways, and if and only if the individuals interact in non-linear ways, then in that case you might be able to say that the complexity of the system does not require any overall centralized coordination. So that's one situation. If the components can actually interact non-linearly, then you can say maybe they don't need coordination to produce what they do. However, the other situation is if individuals cannot, if they have no ability to initiate non-linear interactions. And we're not just saying that they don't take part in non-linear interactions, but they have no ability to initiate such interactions. There's a difference there. In this case, there would be no emergent complexity unless there is some other form of coordination to account for these non-linear interactions and therefore the complexity of the system. So the point is, you can't have it both ways. Either you have individual component agents that are capable of non-linear interaction, or you have to have coordination to account for complexity. And this becomes clearer when we look at the types of complexity that are cited as examples. For instance, besides the ant colony, there are human cities, we mentioned them, international economies, ecosystems and food webs, plus neuron and brain networks are counted as complex systems, and also so are the biological processes of cells. Now, I've separated them here in my slide. Why? Because I think they fall into two groups. The first group involves individual agents that are all conscious entities, ants, humans and cities and living creatures and food chains. So the individual components are conscious entities, and we would agree that these systems can exhibit complexity and emergent properties, and there may be no obvious overall coordination, and sometimes we wish there was more. Why? Because the individuals are conscious entities, they're willful beings, and therefore they are able to initiate weird and wonderful ways of doing things together. Either they're just interested in doing their own thing, or they're playing their part in what is expected of them, something that they feel bound or destined to do. And in that way, they produce non-linear interactions because they are conscious, willful beings. So that's the first group. So they may not have coordination. So they are scenario one, right? Now, what about the others in our list? You know, are neurons or the molecules in cells conscious? I don't think anyone's, there may be some people who suggest that, but generally we don't regard them, we have not identified how they would be conscious. Are they capable of initiating non-linear interactions themselves? Well, we can't see how they would do that themselves, but do their networks, like neural networks or biological processes, do they exhibit seeming complexity? And the answer is, well, yes, they do. But if the individuals can't initiate non-linear activities, yet the system exhibits complexity, this must be scenario two, in which the system is being coordinated by something beyond itself, something outside of that system, something other than the individual components themselves. And it needs that coordination in order to account for the fact that they cannot initiate nonlinear activities and amongst themselves. Now, in earlier talks, we just demonstrated that neurons and brain activity are influenced by intention arising from the conscious entity, the Atma. And we also established that within every living organism, the conscious entity, Atma, is present. So now we have to ask ourselves, is the intention arising from the overall consciousness within an organism possibly the cause and coordinating factor of the complexity seen within the nonlinear activities, both within the brain activity and also within cellular activity? Is the consciousness of an organism linked to the top-down coordination that we see that is happening within an overall organism? So we know that intention arising from consciousness can influence physical and biological systems. You remember we went through that in part 2. We showed you the results obtained from the engineering department at Princeton University under their program Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research, PAIR. You know, and I'll just remind you, from 800,000 trials over 27 years, they demonstrated that conscious intent alone could produce a desired effect on physical and on mechanical systems. And they showed that there was a statistical significance for all of that, which, when you compare it against chance, it was equivalent to odds of 1 in 3 billion. So we kind of see that intention is effective, achieving the sort of results regardless of proximity in space and time. That was their conclusion. And we also talked about how this effect might be involved in what seems to be happening within the brain. That the neurons themselves do not have the ability to demonstrate nonlinear activity, you know. Oh, sorry. They do seem to behave in a way that demonstrates nonlinear activity. However, because of how we've analyzed it, we can conclude that both individual neurons and brain networks are examples of complex nonlinear activity within biological cells whose activity seems to be coordinated by consciousness. Very quickly, without trying to repeat exactly how the activity within the cells worked, what the diagram shows is that for a neuron to fire, the charges that build up on it have to get through the axon hillock. It's like a threshold that has to be crossed. Now, if the threshold fired at the same level of charge every time, it would be deterministic, but it doesn't. The threshold at which the axon hillock will let through charge varies up and down, and therefore it's a nonlinear effect. But what is producing that nonlinear effect? We showed that part of the proposition is that intention may be acting on the quantum activity within the microtubules within the neuron and producing the effect of the variation of the axon hillock. So we're suggesting that even the nonlinear activities of neurons and brain activity is related to the coordinating effect of consciousness. Now, this analysis of complexity theory is a little challenging if it's new to you, but the reason I want you to consider it is because of how often it is misused to claim that systems built from simple components can themselves create emergent complexity without any form of outside coordination. And our point is, there's no justification for claiming there is no outside coordination unless you can demonstrate that your simple components are themselves able to initiate and not just take part in nonlinear interactions. And really, we never see that except when those components are individual conscious entities in their own right. And they have their own agenda, their own agency, and their own decision making. And I don't think we're suggesting that's the case with the DNA molecule or the other organelles of the cell. So let me summarize this like this. Either, in terms of complex systems, either they are made up of individual conscious entities, conscious components, or the system that exhibits complexity does so because it is coordinated by a higher or overall conscious entity. In either case, we cannot separate complexity that we see happening in systems from consciousness. And this is crucial for our understanding of the complexity that we observe in biology. Our proposition is that consciousness coordinates complexity in physical and biological systems, and we know consciousness exists within our own human body. And we've seen that it probably exists in all living creatures. So we accept ourselves as that entity related to the functioning of our particular body. We view ourselves as that entity who expresses our own will, and we express our will to utilize this body so that we can enjoy experiences throughout our lifetime. So, is there such an entity present in all life forms, even the humble E. coli bacteria? That was something we looked at in the past. So from the coordinating agency of consciousness at the organism level, we're suggesting that there is a cascade of coordination flowing top down to influence all levels of activity within the body. So the cells of our body carry out their complex biochemistry on account of the top-down agenda related to the interests of consciousness within the organism. So we need to expand on this in order to explain how it all works. But first, a question that is sometimes raised by, it's been raised by several viewers of this series. They've asked me, well, is there a conscious entity, an Atma, within each cell of the body? Now, perhaps the reason for suggesting that there might be a conscious entity within the cell is that the cell itself seems to behave in complex and wonderful ways. It seems to coordinate complex behavior within its own molecular machinery. However, the complex biochemistry at the cellular level can be attributed to the presence and the effect of the consciousness of the overall organism cascading down. Now, if you want to consider the insight of Vedic texts, I don't know of any that give a direct reference to say that there is a presence of an Atma within the individual cells of a physical body. So the cell is not counted within the list of bodies that are used by a predominating Atma. Rather, both Vedanta and even the Gita indicate that the single predominating Atma has the ability to infuse the full body with its coordinating potency. So no actual need to postulate that the cell requires its own Atma in order to handle coordination and complexity. Now, there are other Atmas in your body. There's trillions of them. In fact, current estimates are that you share your body with between 40 and 100 trillion other microbes. You've only got 37 trillion cells, and there is as many, or maybe 3 times as many, microbes and Atmas. So altogether, these microbes make up your own personal microbiome. So you could think of yourself as the king or queen of the city-state of your body, and all these microbes are your citizens. Some of them are up to no good, but the vast majority are trying to lead honest, decent lives, performing all sorts of helpful activities to keep the city going. So I suggest be nice to them all. Now, at this stage, I want to remind ourselves of our ontological model, so we can consider the metaphysics that are worked within all of this. You remember that we presented this in part 2. We modeled that there was a single reality, but we understand that there are 3 distinct functions: the field of consciousness, the cognitive functions, and what we call physical stuff. So when this model is brought down to an individual level, we defined it that the consciousness is represented by the Atma, the individual unit of the field of consciousness. So this Atma exhibits individual, subjective, conscious experience and expression. And so in effect, the Atma is the thing that you and I identify as the me that knows it exists. Now, then there's the cognitive functions are broken down into 3 subcategories, and we describe their specific distinctive functions as the persona, i.e. the actor on the stage. This is our sense of person or selfhood, the person we believe we are in this life. Then there's another function, the gatekeeper of intelligence. This is an aspect of cognition that filters perception and thinking, and it does so in terms of a set of filters or preferences or biases. And what it is filtering is all the stuff that is there from the pool of the mind. The pool of the mind is that aspect of cognition that receives input from our senses and also from our volition and generates thoughts, reflections, and desires. And then there's the physical stuff, and we said that's in 2 categories, which I'm just going to repeat now without having to go into the detail: the proto-physical qualities and what are physically observable properties. And I mention all of this now because each facet will be important as we develop our understanding of how the exact process by which psychology affects and coordinates our biology. But for now, what I'd like to do is to simplify it down, strip it down to the basics, all that we need to know for this week. So particularly, let's have a very simple model in terms of our own body. I'm going to call this the psychophysical model. Here it is. We've got consciousness as the Atma. We're talking about an individual here. So that's me, say, or you. We're the Atma. We have a mind, and that's grouping all the cognitive functions together, just mind. And we have a physical body. That's all the physical stuff that makes up this organism that we're inhabiting. So this provides us with a kind of model linking the nature of consciousness with the physicality of our body. So our psychophysical model. And it goes along with our ontological model, the bigger one I've just been presenting, which really is designed to show the elementary functions of reality, from consciousness through the cognitive elements to the physical stuff. And the specific version of that was previously we talked about a psychological model, which considers the way individual consciousness is processed within the mind and manifests as intention, action, and perception. Now, some viewers have asked, well, how do, we're looking at different models, how does that work? But actually you have to appreciate that each model is intended for a specific purpose, to reveal certain kind of aspects of what is at work here. But they are all consistent with one another. The psychological model is a specific version of our ontological model, and our psychophysical model, as shown here, is the simplified version of the psychological model. So all these models are consistent, and they each reveal different things. So we're going to put our psychophysical model to work. Here it is. Now, in an earlier talk we discussed when the mind gathers data via our senses, that information takes a form within the mind. For instance, our eyes and senses are picking up the rose. We experience it as spatial. We sense of it being in a space in front of us. It sits on top of a rose bush, perched on a long stem. It's got its own space, and we sense its form and shape, and we sense its softness of its lines and its many petals overlapping. So also our mind fills with the colors that come from it, and our nose is picking up on its fragrance. So we have a spatial sense, a picture, a kind of qualia imagery that of all of this coming to us. And we link that with the outside world and what is there. We link it with our sense of how our body is structured, where our senses are, and how they're interacting with this object. And our mind fills with all of this. So what is happening is that the mind is being molded as it accommodates each of these sensory qualities within it. The mind isn't just a box. It's not a computer thing, It's something that is free-form and malleable. It flexes and expands and contracts as it fills with our sensory perceptions, along with the other thoughts and sensations and emotions that all go with that. Now, what shape is the mind? Well, really whatever we fill it with. So this is true even from volition. So we discussed how we got free will. We express that free will as the wish to enhance pleasurable experiences. Well, that's very broad. But the mind takes that aspiration for securing something pleasurable to enjoy with, and it generates specific ideas and plans and desires. For instance, it's a warm day perhaps, and your mind is telling you deserve a treat, something cool, sweet. So the mind says, what about an ice cream? And the mind takes that form of your imagination. You can sense the ice cream cone in front of you. You can practically taste it. You feel the melted cream is dripping off it in the heat. So I suggest the best way to think of the mind is how it is taking its form and shape from its content. And now, instead of a box, we have a little kind of cloud effect here. It gathers your wishes and your sensory perceptions and builds a kind of mental sculpture to represent it all. Now, this psychological form holds all the subtle information required to do two things. One is to represent the content of all of that to your conscious awareness, i.e. it's presenting it to you and you go, wow, that's what I'm experiencing. We experience the content of our mind. But also the content of the mind is able to produce a subtle template that can specify the information in order to manifest qualities and properties of physical stuff. I'm going to give you a few examples now of the ability to the mind not just to affect physical things like we saw in the pair experiments, but to impose properties of form onto physical and biological systems. And I'm going to start with a little story because you've worked hard with all the complexity theory. Now, some years ago, I had a friend who was a veterinary surgeon working in London, and he explained to me this rather curious incident with a cat. This cat was referred to him from another vet. He said it seems to have been in an accident. I don't know what's wrong with it. Can you have a look at it? So the vet looked at the cat and realized it had cancer of the spleen, which is very, very rare within cats. Common in dogs and humans, but not in cats. So he called in the owners of the cat and had to break the news to them that I'm really sorry, but I've just done analysis. Doesn't look good. Your cat has cancer of the spleen. And at that moment, the wife of the couple exploded. Just said, no, I'm the one with cancer of the spleen. I was diagnosed 6 months ago, and it was considered to be terminal. And the vet didn't know what to make of this. But then the couple explained when she was diagnosed with her cancer disorder, the husband went and got a cat and said, I want you to take this cat and cuddle it anytime you're feeling low. It will be your doctor. And, just cuddle it and it'll help make you feel better. And that's what she had been doing for 6 months. And somehow or other, what had happened was that the disorder that was happening within her cell biology was transferred to the baby, to the cat. The wife was clear of her cancer. Unfortunately, the poor cat died. But what's going on here? How can the cause that produces cancerous biological activity in one organism be transferred into a living thing, another one, into the cat? So I think this story raises some interesting questions, and I don't suggest that it contains answers, but I offer this incident just to open us up to the role of how the mind and our own psychology has its effect on health and more. Now, this effect on health is called psychogenesis, and it's defined as the process by which psychological factors can cause and influence physical disease. Now, I think in the past people had a suspicion that that was the true, but in our kind of more modern, chemically focused approach of modern medicine, we've kind of dispensed with that sort of thinking. But it is making a comeback. And we're not just talking about psychology and mental health, we're talking about the idea of psychogenesis in terms of psychology and physical health, including the cause of disorders and also their potential treatment. So although this might seem, and although many kind of clinicians have taken on the idea of psychology, actually many have done so with an assumption that the reason psychology matters is that psychology is ultimately biological in nature, because they believe the brain produces consciousness in all mental phenomena, and therefore anything that is simply psychology is simply neural activity. Now, there is certainly many aspects of what is happening that can be related to how psychology seems to initiate neural activity, the release of hormones, the release of certain chemicals, certain feedback things, maybe the immune system. However, just thinking that the brain produces consciousness, that is limiting enough, as we have talked about, but it also stops us understanding some of the important ways that psychology can work beyond what we can attribute to neural kind of being in the medium of it. So what's missing is that they don't recognize that there are certain extra biological effects that psychology can offer, which is more than simply the deterministic neural biological influence, something that is outside of neurology and biology. So what we're suggesting is that there are psychological factors which are not found within the organism's biology, but play a role in coordinating non-linear interactions of biological components, and also doing something that isn't there in the neurology or in the DNA, and that is determining the specific morphology of that organism. Now we start with a simple one. There's an old saying, laughter is the best medicine, and there's been lots of studies showing how laughter and general positivity seems to release hormones and encourages immune cells. Now, is this just activating useful neural activity, that it sends good signals, or is there more? Well, there's some studies which kind of indicate that there is more, that even just the psychological intention of willing to live has an interesting effect and assists healing process and prolongs life. There's also kind of distant healing and all those sort of processes where the psychology seems to belong to someone else. Now, but still, let's consider an intervention where the physiological issue is harder to link with the neurological. And that is that, the idea of placebos. A placebo is defined as an intervention with no known physical consequence, but which improves a person's health. It's beneficial. Now, typically a doctor will give a sugar pill that has 0 chemical active ingredients in it, but these days we find that they're very effective at alleviating symptoms, even treating certain things like asthma and ulcers, actual physical kind of problems. Now, you'd wonder that now we all know about placebos. So wouldn't the effect of knowing that placebos, don't have any chemical things in them, mean that the effect is on the wane? And that's not true. There's a study from America that shows that actually the effect of placebos is increasing. And they say that's because there's so much TV promotion of all sorts of drugs, go to your doctor and ask for this, that, and the other, because that will cure them, that people have a real deep belief and faith in the idea that a pill will cure them. So it's reached the point that when they do drug tests, they're having problems getting the new drugs to pass what is the double-blind tests. They might show that this drug is able to be effective in, say, 50% of the population in dealing with this particular issue, but so is the placebo. And that's where their difficulty lies. And the effect of a placebo is even stronger if you inject it into someone, or if you do a simulated surgical operation. That is very, very effective. And they're now wondering if some of the real surgeries that they're doing actually are no better than placebos. And one of the best studies with this was on arthroscopic knee surgery, where they showed that those recovering after placebo surgery of the knee actually showed better capability of walking and stair climbing than those who had a real honest to God, bit of surgery. And then there's nocebos. They're the opposite. They're also chemically inactive, but patients are told these could contain side effects. And of course, people then manifest the side effects because of being told about that. Now, there are many other examples, but these show that the mind can act to coordinate biology and redress disorders within the body, and even produce side effects, perhaps. But we now want to look at examples in which specific forms within the mind can make a specific impression on the form of the body. The first one, I think the best study is in hypnosis. And Edward Kelly from University of Virginia has looked at this in depth. He reckons that most times the examples of hypnosis is used for pain relief, even with invasive surgeries, that at times when it's not possible to give anesthesia, you can actually do it with hypnosis. But in terms of actual treatments, skin conditions are very good. So hypnosis has been shown to remove allergic reactions, lesions, eczema, even a nasty thing called ichthyosis, which is fish scale disorder. But he also notes that hypnosis can be used to deliberately produce psychophysical effects in subjects, like forming blisters can be made to appear, or people can have cosmetic enhancement of the various physical features under hypnosis. That works. Now, there was one male patient who was trying to give up smoking, and his therapist suggested to him, well, look, you should really think of how smoking affects others. I mean, what if you were a mother carrying an unborn baby? Now, he heard this in hypnosis, and he took it to heart, and was soon convinced he was pregnant. And he displayed classical, physical, obvious symptoms of false pregnancy. He had morning sickness, he had a swollen stomach, he'd even got secretion from his nipples. Now, the next bunch of cases are maternal impressions. These are situations in which an expectant mother observes some dramatic, usually traumatic or horrific imagery during her pregnancy. And this produces a physiological impact on her unborn child. And again, the University of Virginia studied many hundred cases of this to see if there's a close correspondence between what the event the mother said she saw and the effect on the child. And out of 50 key cases that they looked at, 32 of them involved birth defects, including serious defects like the congenital absence of a limb. A typical case was a woman who witnessed a man having his left ear chopped off, and her baby was born without a left earlobe. Now, is this just coincidence? Well, it looks like there's too many of these type of cases that you can so easily dismiss them in that way. Now, it's interesting because transfers from mother to unborn child do not take place with any kind of neural signaling, because mother and daughter, there's no nerve messaging between the brain of the mother to the embryo. They're separate in that respect. So any transference of effect has to be in a sort of non-neural psychological effect, something like the example of our Dr. Cat. And here's one example I just thought I'd throw in because we've discussed remote viewing. There was a case of a lady called Olga Kal, who could not only receive images and words from a distant source using a type of remote viewing, but she could then manifest the picture and letters as eruptions on her skin. Now, all of these are helpful to some degree in appreciating how the form of mental content may impose the form of some physical change in the body. But I think the most important examples of how mental content can do that are the group that are under the title Cases of the Reincarnation Type. And for these, we look to the most voluminous study carried out by an academic, and that's the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson there at the University of Virginia. He studied over 2,000 cases himself of spontaneous remembrance of past lives, usually in children from various cultures in the world, but generally where there was some kind of familiarity or acceptance of the principle of reincarnation. And he used this approach because spontaneous past life memories in a child can be investigated using very strict scientific methodology protocols. So in order to collect this data, he documented the child's statements of a previous life. Then he identified the deceased person that the child remembers that they were. And then Dr. Stevenson checked to see if the facts of the deceased person's life matched the child's memory and statements. So his methods were systematic, and they kind of aimed to rule out all the possible, what he called, other explanations for the child's memories. I'm just going to give you one story in this, and that is Torin, or Titu Singh as he's known in the family. And when he was 2.5, Titu began to tell his family of his other life in Agra, which was about 30 miles away, I believe. And he said, oh, I used to live in Agra, and I was the owner of a radio and TV shop, and my name is Suresh Verma, and I had a wife and 2 children, but I was shot dead, then cremated, my ashes thrown in the river. Now, his parents didn't take him very seriously at first, but he did exhibit behaviour which was a little odd, because he didn't really act as if he was part of their family. He kind of still felt he belonged somewhere else. So his elder brother decided to go to Agra to check it out. He found a shop called Suresh Radio, and he went in, and it was then being run by a widow named Uma, whose husband had been shot just as Titu had described. So Uma then decided to visit the same family the next day and see if there was any truth in what was going on. She arrived with her family unannounced. Titu happened to be outside, and he saw them first and immediately recognized them and shouted to his parents, hey, my other family have come. So Titu asked Uma, sit near me, which is odd for a 5-year-old to do to a grown woman. And he asked about the children. He talked in detail about a family outing that they all went to the fair, and gave information that only Uma would have known. He even described burying gold in a hole in the house. So it was then agreed that Titu should go and visit Agra. And so when he and the family entourage arrived, Suresh's 2 children were, hidden off playing amongst some other neighborhood kids. This was kind of set up as a test. But Titu singled them out immediately. And when he went into his old shop, he started saying, oh, you've changed this and that. Oh, that used to be there, but then you've changed this. Now, a very good detailed account. And as part of this sort of analysis, and Stevenson has, thousands of reports like this. Some of them are a bit easier and better documented. Others still maybe a little fragmentary. But he kind of then decided, well, what sort of theories can account for all of this evidence? And he went through them and divided into 2 types. The first were what he called normal, and these involved coincidence, or maybe the accounts were invented, or maybe the parents are imposing this on the children, or maybe there's some type of collusion between the families, agreeing to back up each other's statements. But none of them seem to really address the depth of detail and the specific aspects of the events that he had uncovered. So he looked at, well, are there any other paranormal, non-normal explanations? He looked at ESP. Well, is a person tapping into the minds of another person? But that didn't seem to be the case, because these were kids who didn't show any other evidence of an ESP. But more importantly, they were expressing kind of real emotional identification with that previous life, far more than would be expected in just some kind of clairvoyance or something like that. And then, well, what about possession? Well, that's, if you believe in possession, fine, but that doesn't explain the birthmarks which are present from birth, nor the way the child actually integrated the idea that I used to have this life, and now I was there, and I am now here in this life. That's not how you would expect possession to work. And the third one is the maternal impressions, and we've already suggested they're a valid phenomena, but they don't match the details of these incidents. So from all the 3,000 cases that Stevenson and his whole team have, they concluded that the most plausible explanation that matches all the evidence is a type of reincarnation known as metempsychosis. Now, there's different forms of reincarnation. Metempsychosis entails reincarnation as the transmigration of the conscious entity along with its mind, from inhabiting one body into inhabiting another. Now, it's important to note that in all these cases where children can recall aspects of their past lives, their death in that previous lifetime was untimely and generally violent. It's like they didn't expect it. They weren't prepared for it. Something remained unfulfilled. So these stories that Ian Stevenson compiled, whilst providing compelling evidence for the reincarnation, may not be typical of the standard way it occurs. So even for the children who speak of their past lives, their memories tend to fade over time. So by the time they reach 10, they've kind of settled into their current life, and that's effect is stronger than what is being carried over in those other memories. And that kind of indicates why most of us maybe do not remember previous lives which aren't violent or so dramatic. However, one aspect of Titu's story which is really important for us is this picture here. We're going back to the murder. Titu accurately described how Suresh had been shot in the head at night while sitting in his car after arriving home from work. And that was corroborated by and the documents. The autopsy report of Suresh, the guy who was killed, confirmed that he had died from a bullet wound to the right temple. And the autopsy showed the exact size and location of the wound and the exit wound on the opposite side of Suresh's head. And here we see on Titu's head, this is the right side, this is the entry mark of the bullet being kind of manifest here as a sort of birthmark, a round indented shape which coincides exactly with the location of the entry wound that killed Suresh. And he had a second birthmark on the other side of his head that matched the exit wound. Now, such birthmarks are very common in many of the stories of violent death. And Ian Stevenson categorized all his different cases depending on the type of birthmark, how it was received, and how the individuals gave their testimonies, whether it was the child, whether it was the family, whether it was from medical records. And of course, I would say my preferred cases are the ones in which the child itself provides the testimony about the deceased person and where the birthmarks can be correlated with medical or post-mortem records. But as tempted as I am, I'm not going to give you any more cases today because I need to get into our takeaways from all these examples. And that is that the mind is a malleable, subtle organ. It gathers the inputs from our senses and also from our volition. And it generates ideas, thoughts, and emotions. And the mind flexes and forms according to this content. It takes the shape of its content. And I'm speaking figuratively here. We don't actually understand the shape of our minds or what the minds are made of. But we can just understand that there must be some form manifesting in this sort of mental state. It's a way of conceptualizing what seems to be observed in the evidence, that the mind seems to fashion and retain morphological information. And thus the mind can act as a template for features that appear in the physical body. Now, we've already discussed how the same information is present in different forms in the mind, and then in the proto-physical state, and in the physical properties. It is the same guna data, the same bunch of data, but in the observable physical world, it manifests as properties that we can see. In the tanmatric proto-physical state, it manifests as the subtle sensory qualities. And in the mind, it manifests in the form of ideas and forms and qualia and, including all the emotions, all those sort of things. It takes up that sort of shape. So, because the same specifying information present in mental form, our suggestion is that the birthmark cases that Stevenson analyzed, you can model them like this. Back to our simple kind of model here. Here's a picture of our mind, full of mental concepts. And we showed earlier how those concepts have been fed from both volition, one side, and from sensory input on the other. And most of these are kind of transitory kind of thoughts and emotions and experiences. They're not particularly significant. And most of the time, they're kind of very little of importance is really deeply retained. You know, they're stored in the depths of our pool, but they're not manifesting as the active form of our mind. But what about a life-changing event? Something of an unimaginable trauma or emotion where you see something or feel something, or you fear deeply for your life, not just a momentary scare, but something prolonged. What was the realization you're actually about to die, to leave behind everything you've ever loved and worked so hard to attain? You know, might that not leave an indelible imprint on your mind? Something that would be retained and focused on again and again? Stevenson suggests that it is the intense focus on something which creates its imprinting potency, and that can be carried over and impart physical marks on the next person's, the reincarnated physical body. So, and remember that your mind holds a clear mental picture of your overall bodily form. If you feel a pain, a sting, an itch, or anything, even without looking, you know where it is. Your mind has got a picture of your body. It can visualize it. So our diagram showing the sensory input of pain and the response of consciousness to the felt experience of that pain. So these are inputs which will be present within the form of the mind. So our mental form might be better represented like this, where we have an image of ourselves and we have an image of where that pain or trauma may be located. And it may be something where we are bleeding out. This might kill us. So there is real focus, in this case, on the mind is showing that the focus is on the leg. So emotional energy distorts the form of our mental concept of the body. And according to many traditional and an increasing number of modern medical clinicians, this can have a direct impact on what is happening in the physical body to which the mind is connected. So even within our own lifetime, within the psychological factors produce physiological changes in the body. And it suggested that many disorders that develop over an extended period may be connected to deep-rooted issues and emotions which we are retaining within the pool of our mind and revisiting perhaps. We have made them part of our psyche. So in recognition of how the mind takes this mental form of the body, in Sanskrit, the mind is referred to, this composite of the mind is referred as the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle form of the body. And because this mental form provides a template which then specifies the physical form of one's biological body, it is called the Sharira Linga, the basic form and shape of the body. Now, I'm going to conclude by bringing together all these points. And from everything that we've heard today and in previous sessions, we derive the following inferences. That the content of the mind is its form. It constitutes its form. This is the form that the mind takes, its content. And we may refer to this mental form as the subtle form of a body, the Sukshma Sharira. This provides, the mind then holds the concept of the body as something existing in space with features and senses. So this is the mental form, the Sukshma Sharira. And this then provides the template for the overall physiological form of the body. And this mental template, we're going to refer to mental template, but in Sanskrit, Sharira Linga. Now, in terms of what we've been discussing about the nature of the top-down approach to biology, this template of the mind is available at the organism level. It is part of the system of the overall organism, not any of its components. So the important fact about the subtle body as the physiological template is that the subtle template exists at the level of the whole organism. And that's what we needed in order to explain where the template is for our top-down systems approach. We know there's no template within the DNA or within the cell or in any other levels of organization. And it was concluded that the environment isn't adequate either. So with the concept of the subtle body, we have a mechanism that takes into account both environmental factors, because they will influence the form of the subtle body, but it's a consciousness response to those inputs from the environment, and it encodes both the volition of the Atma and its experiences. It encodes that into a psychological shape with all that content, and produces a psychological template for the mind. And that template has agency. We've seen in the examples today how mental imagery can produce changes in physiology, and this goes all the way down to the cells, and the examples we gave last week about how organisms can change the use of their own genes, how they can change the activities of their cells, depending on what they're trying to do. So we've seen that it has agency. So we propose that the mind in its subtle form has agency to specify and to coordinate the activities at every level of our biological setup. And that this effect is available to embryogenesis, meaning that this template is said to be present, it's active and efficient from the earliest moments that embryogenesis is happening. Because if it wasn't, then we'd still be lacking an agent of coordination when we talk about cell differentiation, or how the construction, those cells are constructed into organs and systems, or what is defining the morphology. So this is all happening straight after the fertilization of the egg into that single cell zygote. So whatever is supplying the template must be present, active, and causally efficient from the earliest moment of fertilization. Now, the question can be asked then, but wait a minute, how is the conscious entity, the Atma, active and able to coordinate these early stages of the embryo? Does the Atma need to know how to manipulate biology? I mean, I don't know which genes I need in order to produce which proteins, for my liver or something like that. But the process doesn't require such know-how. It doesn't require to be a conscious or attentive process. Rather, the way that the subtle body operates in its kind of coordinating effect is that it is operating subconsciously. It is part of the mechanism of the body and the mind together. It doesn't require us to have any know-how. It doesn't require us to be conscious or attentive to it. Now, we already discussed how much of our free will and volition is delegated to the cognitive functions. They generate all the ideas and desires for you, and they initiate motion and behavior on your behalf. There's a certain acquiescence, but they're doing a lot of the work. And then another level, the brain takes care of huge number of autonomic functions, your heartbeat, your digestion, most of your breathing, pretty well all the activities and the functioning of your organs are being handled by the brain without your having to kind of get involved. Similarly, the subtle template is another part of this autonomic operation at work behind the scenes, that's doing everything your body needs. It doesn't require you to know how it does its job. The Atma, as we've said, is only interested in enjoyment and experience that the body offers. We are conscious witnesses of the activities of our body. We are not the conscious manipulators of all its functions. And it's only at certain times that our conscious experience and volition are strong enough to impact the subliminal processes that regulate the body in its function or development. And that's why the physiological effects that we cited today as demonstrating the agency of kind of the mind in terms of what we consciously are aware of are relatively small effects. They're small in compared to the overall way that the Sukshma Sharira, the Sharira Linga, this subtle template is able to specify and coordinate the big stuff, like the total biology for the complete form of the body. So, our psychophysical model, do we need more detail and explanation to really build this out? Of course. But please remember that the analysis by other biologists is an admission that the current modern synthesis of standard biology has currently no proposition whatsoever to explain what agent might be responsible for the two key mysteries of complex biology, i.e. morphogenesis, where the overall shape of the body comes from, and embryogenesis, how the cells differentiate and specialize and generate and replenish everything that is needed within our bodies. So there's nothing available to the modern biologist, whether in our genes, in a bottom-up process, or from the environment in a top-down process, to fill this gap. So even the simplest things that we might do is still a conundrum. You might think, I want to raise my hand. Here it goes. I raise my hand. However, we've no idea of the biological, neurological process, how thought is converted into that specific motor action by the brain. We just know it happens, but we don't know how. So I just want to reassure biologists working out there that this psychophysical model and all the points I have just outlined doesn't require us to reject any of the discoveries and advancement of modern biology. Everything that you've worked on still holds. You know, the point is that modern biology already operates on the basis that it confronts non-linear complexity at all sorts of levels within and without of the cell. Now, the biologists may not be comfortable with that, but they kind of work around it. They continue to describe the pathways as best they can. But it's just that a physicalist version of biology cannot explain why that complexity occurs, other than to suggest that maybe non-linear behavior produces emergent properties. Maybe it's just some kind of chance activity. And that's not an explanation at all. So we offer our psychophysical model as extra help. It doesn't replace your biology. It simply can be linked to it. It doesn't change anything that you're working on. And it links together the three most important factors of a living organism: its source of consciousness, its mind, and its physical body. And even in its early stage of development, I suggest this model is showing promise. And that's something we will explore more next week. Wait a minute. I hear you scream into the ether. Didn't you just mention reincarnation as a way of showing how mental experiences can be carried from one previous body and presented in a new body? But surely evidence corroborating reincarnation is a big deal in itself. You might think I've kind of undersold it. After all, what happens after death is perhaps the biggest mystery that humans can ponder. And we've just tossed it out there as if it's not that important. Yeah, it's true. I have used the evidence of reincarnation not so much as a validation of reincarnation itself, but to help us understand how the psychophysical model may work. Now, we've already mentioned several times that we regard consciousness as non-temporal. So there are questions to be addressed. How all of this works in relationship to physical bodies, which themselves are definitely temporal. So yes, we will have to explore a bit more of that in future. So I hope that you'll join me next week for number 8 in this particular series, how species get their forms. And because we cannot take questions through the internet, it seems, we'd like you to send them through by email to info@sbi.org. So we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.